Today we're working on the Telltale Heart Literary Analysis. This is a 2-day assignment. We'll do half today and half for our next class period. At the top of the analysis, I have our learning targets, and I also have a synopsis of the short story. If you have not yet completed the guided reading for the Telltale Heart, there is a link to the video that goes through that guided reading and helps you with the answers to the embedded questions. It also models annotating the text for those particular sections of that activity. We have 10 questions we're going to answer, and we're going to use this to analyze our short story text. The first one, number 1, how does our author, Edgar Allan Poe, strategically use narrative pacing in order to create a mood within his Gothic tale? Why are some sections slower, staring at the old man and waiting for the open eye, while other sections are quick, the actual death of the old man? So here we have our definition of narrative pacing. I embedded that in here for you. Narrative pacing is how quickly or how slowly the author is taking the reader through the events of a story, and this can affect the story's mood. That is, the reader's feelings while reading events of a story. So here we're talking about narrative pacing and why we think Poe has some sections that are slower and other sections are quickly described. So let's think about it. First, starting with slow pacing. Why do you feel Edgar Allan Poe takes 5 pages to describe the stalking of the old man at night? He uses repetition, and he keeps describing his actions by saying, I went into the old man's room, and for 7 nights, I would take an hour to go into the room. I would take an hour to open the lantern. I would stare at the old man, waiting for the eye to be open, but it never was, so I could not do the deed. And he keeps repeating this. So all of this is such slow pacing in the exposition and rising action. And what is it doing? It's creating suspense for the reader. So we can put something like slow pacing through the exposition and rising action of the story. The Telltale Heart by Poe creates suspense for the reader. Right? At some point, you stop and you ask yourself, is he actually going to do it? Is he going to commit the murder? Or is he not? And Poe is doing this because he wants to kind of have the reader at one point hope that the murder actually occurs, and is having so much suspense that they just want that climactic moment to happen. So that's the slow pacing. It's creating suspense. So again, slow pacing through the exposition rising action creates suspense for the reader. Now on the flip side of this, what do you think the quick pacing does? So when we see the actual murder of the old man, it happens in 2 sentences. We just had 5 pages of exposition and rising action, and then the climactic moment is in 2 sentences, right? He rushed into the room, he grabbed the mattress, and he flipped it over the old man, killing the old man. So why does Poe go so quickly through that section? Well, because it's creating excitement for the reader. And it's finally at that climactic moment where if Poe were to drag it out too much, then the reader would become disinterested and kind of walk away from the short story. So eventually you have to give the reader what the reader wants. So we could put something here like quick pacing during the climax of the short story adds excitement for the reader and prevents You can't have an entire short story with slow pacing because it's going to bore the reader at some point and they're going to want to walk away. So you need to have quick pacing at some portions to create that excitement. All right, so that is page 1 of the analysis, is looking at narrative pacing. So let's take a look at number 2. Explain why you believe the author wrote from the first person limited narrative perspective. What does it do for the mood of the Gothic tale? Also, explain how the short story would have been different if Poe had written from a third person omniscient narrative perspective. So, the first person perspective is the character talking about what he or she is seeing. And we have a limited narrative perspective, meaning we only get the thoughts and the feelings of our narrator, who is a deranged character. He's an unreliable narrator. So what does this do for the mood? What does this do for the reader's feelings? By only being shown the perspective of an unreliable narrator. We know that he's telling us that he has this disease and it's given him these heightened senses. And honestly, while we're reading, there's a lot of portions where things aren't adding up, right? We're looking at it and we're like, wait a minute, this doesn't make sense. Or wait, this can't be happening. And it's because he's having hallucinations. He's seeing things that aren't real and he's hearing things that aren't real. So this creates confusion for the reader, which is, in Gothic literature, fun because it becomes a mystery. The reader's actively engaged in trying to figure out what's true and what's not. If we were given an omniscient perspective where a narrator was telling us every single thing that was happening and there wasn't any mystery to it, it would be less engaging for the reader. The reader wouldn't be constantly questioning and digging to figure out, is this real or is this something that's in the narrator's imagination? This is something the narrator is making up himself. So let's type something about that here. The limited perspective of our deranged, unreliable narrator creates mystery and engages the reader in questioning what is real and what is in the narrator's imagination. If this were told in the omniscient perspective, the mystery would be gone and the reader less engaged. Okay, keywords here: mystery, engages, what's questioning. All right, so for the next section, we are pulling quotes. So anytime you need to pull a quote, I'm going to be putting in here that it should be in MLA format, okay? And with that, I'm giving you an example, so you can always look at the example here. In addition to all of that, I'm also putting a link here to a YouTube video that goes through MLA citation format. So when we're pulling a quote, the first thing we do is we have our lead in. Excuse me. Our lead in is our own words introducing the author's words. So in the text, the author uses repetition when describing the heartbeat sound. Excuse me. Comma, quotation mark. Then we have, next up in our quotation, is the author's words. The author's words are being pulled directly from the text. And the last piece of our MLA format is the citation, and that's going to be the author's last name and the page number the quote was found on in parentheses. The period goes at the end. Okay, so here for number 3, find a piece of the author's strategic repetition, that's redundancy, repeated words, and quote it using MLA citation format below. So you'll notice there's an arrow here from this box into the next. The first box is you pulling the quote in MLA. The second box is you explaining what does that quote do for the tone and the mood of the story, or what is it doing for the reader in general. because we never just drop a quote and walk away. So the second box is going to be our explanation. So for this, my suggestion was that you exported the story to iBooks. That way we can have iBooks open and we can be working in Canvas at the same time. So we're looking for some repetition. We're looking for repeated words and phrases. There are tons and tons and tons and tons of options that you have in here. So choose one that's right for you. And we are doing MLA format. So the first thing we do is our lead in. An example of repetition in the text is, comma, quotation mark. Now we're going to drop in the author's words. Okay, so I used the text on the right. I found an example of repetition, and I quoted it here. So I'm going to color code it so you can see my sections. The first section we need is our lead in. An example of repetition in the text is, that's my lead in, that's my own words introducing the author's words. Next up, I have my author's words. You can pick anything you want that shows repetition. I could bear those hypocritical smiles no longer. I felt that I must scream or die. And now again, hark louder, louder, louder. Okay, looking for the repetition here. Boop, right here. Okay, and then the last thing in my citation is I have my author's last name and page number in parentheses. All right. So after I pull my quote in MLA format, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to explain how that quote I pulled that has strategic repetition adds to the overall mood of the story. So this one that I pulled is at the very end of the text. And since it's at the end of the text and it's like that last moment, we're getting towards the conclusion, again, it's adding to the suspense of the story. We're wondering, what is he going to do? Like, he is completely freaking out here. He's going to scream or die. He doesn't know what he's going to do. So that makes the reader feel anxious, and we're curious, like, is he going to admit that he did the crime? Is he going to kill the cops? We don't know. It's creating suspense. So I'm going to use my own words here to explain what that quote does for the reader. Make sure you're mentioning repetition because that's what we're analyzing here. So here I put this repetition of louder. When the narrator is talking about the heartbeat he is hearing is creating suspense and mystery for the reader. We know there's no way he's hearing the heartbeat louder and louder from under the floorboards. The old man is dead. We know he's hallucinating, and therefore this repetition adds to the suspense by making the reader question what the unpredictable narrator is going to do next. So I pulled my quote and my lead-in, my author's words, my citation at the end, and then I went in with my own words and described what this particular repetition does for the mood and does for the reader and does for the story as a whole. So this is halfway through our analysis. So you're going to save this and we will do the second half of the analysis in our next class period.